Let me come to you, Daniel Kauma.
Yes, sir.
What about from your vantage point? You belong to the Ugandan diaspora.
Yes.
How do the developments in Uganda really look like to you?
From our perspective as Ugandans in the diaspora, first of all, I want to slide back a little bit to see why we have Bobi Wine as an individual. I think it's very important not to ignore the demographic changes that are happening in our country, and even not only back home but also in the diaspora. Uganda at the moment, 55% of our population is under the age of 18. 70% of our population is under the age of 30. So we have a large young population of youth who are on the streets. The level of education is not sufficient. They are not well trained, not well equipped to be in the labor force at the moment. So they are languishing in Kamocha, in Kasangati, in Natete, on the streets of Kampala. So these young people are looking for an answer. They are looking for a solution. So at the moment, in any country, such a young population will be an asset. When you have a large segment of the population entering the labor force, that's typically an asset in any country because you have a large tax-paying base. Most of the countries in Europe are struggling with a larger, older segment of the population. So for us, Uganda, we have a large population of youth. But the problem is that the youth are unemployed.
Unemployed.
So what would have been an asset is becoming a liability for the country. And those are the people who are looking to the government for answers. And the only person offering them answers and hope at the moment is not our incumbent government, which has been in power for 30 years. They look at a 74-year-old president, Mr. Museveni.
32 perhaps, about 32?
Yeah, exactly. And then they look at Mr. Kyagulanyi Bobi Wine, who is 36, who is our age. He relates more to them. He understands their struggles. He walks on the same streets. He goes to actually to the little stores and little supermarkets where they shop, where they sell their goods. So Kyagulanyi to them exemplifies what they are going through, what their experiences are. So as Ugandans in the diaspora, most of us who come here are also coming out of that environment, looking for opportunities. So there's a connection between what's happening in Uganda and the people who end up flocking to the embassy to get visas to come to the diaspora. It's because we are looking for opportunity. So the same answers those who can't get visas are looking to Kyagulanyi to offer the answers, and leaders like him, us, are trying to find an exit strategy. Where can we find greener pastures? So at the moment, the Minister of Foreign Affairs estimates there's 1.5 million Ugandans in the diaspora, 1.5 and growing. So that means that there is a desire for opportunity. Most Ugandans who live and come to the diaspora, they don't want to necessarily live here, but if those opportunities could be created in our country, would rather be here. So when we see an individual like Kyagulanyi who offers hope to our country, going through the same treatment that we have seen opposition leaders like Kano Kizza Besigye experience, we have to stand up and say no. We cannot allow our country to go through the same phase which we have seen happen before. So Kyagulanyi, the reason why you have Ugandans in Boston, Ugandans here in DC, Ugandans in London, Toronto marching on the streets, it's not because we want to taint the image of our country, but it's because we don't want our country to damage our future leaders like Kyagulanyi and others. So that's why, as a diaspora, you saw us in DC here marching. You are seeing others in Boston speaking up because we think our country has gone through this before. We know our history clearly. We know where Uganda has been since independence. We have never had peaceful power change in our country between different presidents. It has always been violent, and we don't want to go back. So we want a future which is more democratic. We want a future of leaders who are inspiring young people like Kyagulanyi, not only through his deeds, but his music, which is a key part of who he is. He sings about the struggles of the average Ugandan on the streets, and they relate to that.
I see.
That's why they call him the ghetto president. He's the man who is fighting for the poor.
We'll come to you a little bit later. Let me come to you, Jeff. What about you from your vantage point? What do you read out of this? You know, Daniel rightly talks about the changing demographics, and probably he might also have added that these changing demographics in tandem with the social media could probably be a democratic game changer on the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to sort of broaden Daniel's point out a bit, if you look across the entire continent, I don't think what we're seeing happening in Uganda is by any means an isolated incident, right? If you look at the average age across sub-Saharan Africa, it's 19 years old. The average age of those in power is 62 years old. So there's a vast chasm between the up-and-coming youth generation and those leaders who've been in power, like a Museveni, who's been there for 32 years, or a Paul Biya in Cameroon, who's been in power since 1982. And there's no shortage of those. Uganda, I think it's particularly acute. The average age is 16 and a half years old. They've never known another leader besides Yoweri Museveni. And to your point about the use of social media, I think in this particular instance, as well as others, it's been truly remarkable and a real game changer. I think when you look at the outcry about Bobi Wine's unjust detention, the torture that he was the recipient of on behalf of the authorities, you saw a global outcry across social media, across traditional media. And if you look at a lot of the social media traffic, a lot of it was being generated across the Eastern Horn of Africa, much of it coming from Kenya. You saw the Africans Rising Collective, which is very active in West and Central Africa and Francophone Africa, really helping to elevate the cause. And not only Bobi Wine, but you started to see sort of other spin-off initiatives where Free Diane Rwigara, who's currently detained for now 1 year as of today in Rwanda. So I think it's really galvanized a lot of people across the globe because, to Daniel's point, he speaks to a much broader audience than someone like a President Museveni can ever hope to speak to.
Now, Jeff, when you come to African culture, there is this thing called authority rather than reasoning. Authority meaning the older you are, the wiser you are. Right. The more highly placed you are, the more smarter you are, and all that kind of stuff. Are you seeing some fundamental changes of attitudes and mindsets among the ordinary, average African youth?
And from my perspective, I really think you are. I think if you look across the continent and a lot of the popular protests that are happening across the continent, they're being driven by youth, and they're being mobilized by online and social and digital media, which is why I think you're starting to see a counter trend of those in power trying to clamp down on social media. You see it happening in Uganda, for instance, with the social media tax. You see it happening in Zambia, of all places, and particularly around election times, it's becoming the norm now where governments shut down social media. So people cannot organize and they can't mobilize online or in the public square. But I think going back to the larger trend that we're seeing, particularly in Uganda, again, the current ordeal that we're seeing with what happened in Arua, it's not an isolated incident. Going back to 2012, I believe, when MP Sarana Nabanda was poisoned under mysterious circumstances. Daniel mentioned the continuing trials and tribulations of Kizza Besigye. In September of 2017, when you had Uganda's security forces raid the parliament and nearly beat to an inch of her life another member of parliament, Betty Nambuze, who I believe has been laid up in the hospital due to damage to her spine.
Nambuze from Mukono.
Exactly. So this sort of state-sponsored, politically motivated brutality has been happening for 32 years in Uganda. But I think, again, to Daniel's point and to the issues you brought up, the rising youth population, the solidarity that is being built across borders and across boundaries, across East Africa, across the continent.
Internationally.
Exactly, and the diaspora, people like Daniel. I think, and I feel very comfortable sitting here today and saying that if it wasn't for that global outcry, and if it wasn't for people like Daniel and others in the diaspora and those in the country and the brave, courageous activists on the ground raising this to a global level, Bobi Wine would still be behind bars. There's no doubt in my mind. So I think we need to keep activating, we need to keep mobilizing, and we need to keep shining a light on dictators, because what happens in Uganda and elsewhere is, oftentimes abusive leaders are able to get away with what they do, overstepping their powers or instituting harshly repressive or retrograde laws, because no one's paying attention and no one's talking about it. And I think the more light we can shine on that, the better it is for everybody, the better it is for democratic rights, and the better it is for the future, not only of Uganda, but of the entire continent as well.
Very interesting. Daniel, what about supporters of Yoweri Museveni, who say that in Museveni, you're looking at a uniquely gifted leader, something perhaps akin to really, essentially something that is very rarely seen in society. We're talking about something akin to perhaps God's political gift to Uganda.
Right. But we have seen that before, not just in Uganda, where we have strong men who rule a country for decades. We saw that in Libya. We have seen that in Egypt.
You saw that in Zimbabwe, where I just came from.
Yeah, so we are not saying that Museveni hasn't done any good for our country, but you have to create a culture of power change. We see it here in the United States. Once in a while, you'll get a George Bush, you'll get a Barack Obama, you'll get a Donald Trump, and I guarantee you after 8 years, there'll be somebody else, assuming that he doesn't win another term. So having talent doesn't mean that you stay in power for 30 years or 40 years, because the new ideas start running out. Because I saw our friends in Ethiopia a few months ago, when their new prime minister was in Washington, D.C., you see people flying in. Hundreds and thousands of Ethiopians were flying in because it's offering them hope. So you always need that new leader who is going to inspire you, who is going to come and just his presence inspire young people to come out.
Are you reminded, for example, of younger Yoweri Museveni back in 1986?
Yeah. When Museveni came out in 1986 with his 10-point program, people were excited. People came out, they were laying mats on the streets so that the convoys drive through Kampala. We don't see that anymore.
Why is that so? Is it because perhaps there is now what some would call a trust deficit?
Absolutely.
Trust deficit.
Yeah. And throughout the year we have seen, first of all, removing presidential term limits, and then recently they removed age limits. So even the ideas which Museveni spoke of in 1986 of leaders who overstay in power for a long time, he's now violating the same ideas and values which he was against in 1986. So that's why most of us used to support Museveni. I like the ideas, I like the energy, I read his book, Sowing the Mustard Seed. I believed in all the values he stood for in 1986. Most of us were very young. We grew up under Museveni. We liked some of the changes he made through the country. I lived in Mutundo with my grandmother. We didn't have any, they used to bring sugars to LC, like sacks of sugar. People used to come and line up just to get sugar and soap in the villages. So we didn't have services, we didn't have a good road network, we didn't have, so there's been changes that have happened in the country. But those changes do not imply that block out the young, youthful leaders. So we need the complete flow of ideas in our country, and that's why Museveni, in spite of the goods he has done, sort of the good things, we need to create a culture of power change.
Now, Jeff, there are some people who, again, talk about the trust deficit. They argue that when you look at the issue of trust and you associate it with Yoweri Museveni's account, that's probably not so many people believe in that, because they say, for example, in 2001, here is a man who was very much beloved by majority of Ugandans, and he basically persuaded his supporters to vote for him for what he characterized as the second and last constitutionally allowable term, so that he could accomplish three important things. One was to professionalize the army. The second was to secure a regional economic market. And guess what? The third was to choose a successor. This was 2021, and today is 2018.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and you brought this up during the conversation we were just having. If you read what he was writing and speaking about in public in 1986, he said very clearly, the problem in Africa is leaders who overstay their time in power, and here we are 32 years later.
But he corrected himself later in a BBC interview that actually what he meant was the leaders who stay in power without being democratically elected.
Right.
And later in Kisumu, in Kenya, he actually said being in power for a very long time is a very good thing. It's a major asset because he has since become an expert in governance.
Right. And I think what Museveni and others in the region have done a masterful job of doing, to be quite honest, often with the support of the West and the United States in particular, is portray himself as a bastion of stability in an otherwise unstable, tenuous region.
Is
right?
that true?
So my point there is that stability for whom? Who is that stability for? Is it
and
stability
what is the definition of stability, really?
Right. And
if you have no, for example, if you have no socio-economic justice for your people, is that stability really?
No. That's exactly the crux of the question, is you have to ask yourself that. Is it stability for the political opposition who is routinely beaten, jailed, killed, exiled, or disappeared? Is it stability for journalists and the press who are being savagely beaten by Museveni's security forces in the streets of Kampala? Is it stability for our lesbian and gay brothers and sisters in Uganda who are targeted and persecuted on a daily basis due to retrograde laws in the country? Is it stability for the economic migrants leaving the country in droves? My answer would be no. And I think, but you see that with strong men across the continent, these autocrats who sort of embolden themselves and position themselves on the international stage as these somehow arbiters of stability. Again, I mentioned Paul Biya earlier in Cameroon. Again, he's done a masterful job in Central Africa of doing that. And what I think you're starting to see...
He has been in power since 1982.
And arguably since 1975 when he was Prime Minister.
When he was Prime Minister under Ahidjo. Yeah, but there are times when he actually goes to Geneva and occupies the entire top floor of the Intercontinental Hotel for 4 months.
Yeah, a recent
and guess
study,
who pays the bill?
Yeah, the taxpayers.
Very, very poor taxpayers.
A recent study, not to digress too much, but a recent study was recently done that showed that Paul Biya of Cameroon for the past 32 years has spent 4.5 years abroad on private trips, all on taxpayer expense. But going back to Uganda really quickly, today in the Monitor, the Daily Monitor, he was quoted as saying Uganda is in poverty because of big-headed citizens.
Very interesting.
How completely removed can he be from realities on the ground when he has been in power for 32 years and he's blaming the poverty of the country, of which 1/3 of citizens live in dire poverty, on them, not on his leadership.
But do you sincerely believe, if you were to talk to me, Daniel, from the deepest, better part of your Ugandan heart and soul, do you sincerely believe that people like Yoweri Museveni or Paul Biya, for that matter, or even perhaps even more so, Theodore Obiang of Equatorial Guinea, do you sincerely think that these people look at their countries as nations where people have equal shares in those republics, or do they in fact look at them as their private farms?
I think it's very evident that often the longer you stay in power, the more you become out of touch with the realities of the people. I think when you become locked behind gates for not 10, not 15, not 20, not 30 years, I think the longer they stay in power, the more they lose the heart and soul of their nations. So I think most leaders come up with good ideals, so I don't know if it's just a craft to just get into power, but as time goes on, we have seen them walk away from the ideals they start with. So I don't want to say that he didn't mean what he said in 1986. He probably came with good intentions to change Uganda, to liberate Ugandans.
Society is not static, it is dynamic.
Absolutely. And as time has gone on, we have seen that the quote that absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, that's really what's happening to our country. And most of us have grown up under the same leader for now 30 years. So it's really, that's why the biggest probably loss for us as a country was the amendment of our constitution to remove term limits.
We'll come back to that,
Daniel.
Unfortunately, time again is not our best ally. It must be very good and feel good to be a former president of a republic.
Right.
Why is it that some of these people can't take a cue from people like Bakiri Muluzi?
It's really, it's hard to tell for the case of Uganda, honestly. I think most of us have been debating this for a long time, that is it better to be under the same person, especially our older generation, which is risk averse, our parents and grandparents, they kept bringing up memories of the 80s, the 70s, when we had a lot of leaders coming and going violently. But that segment of the population is going away. And I think that explains the violence you have in Uganda today, because the NRM used to count a lot on the rural segment of the population. That used to be their strength. But the last elections in Uganda, the midterm elections, the by-election, sorry, of the members of parliament, which they have lost to the opposition, I think have sent shockwaves throughout the NRM that the demographics of the country are no longer in their favor. Like the times of telling this generation stories of the past, that we fought the war, we came to save you, we liberated the country. Those stories they have used to convince voters, especially in rural Uganda, to vote for them, are no longer resonating with the majority of Uganda, especially the demographics talked about of the young population. So I believe that's really sending shockwaves. That's why you see the reaction you're seeing on Bobi Wine and other opposition leaders, locking them up, charging them with treason. They're coming to terms with the reality of this generation, which is pushing them out, saying we need change, we need democracy, we need power change. Because at the moment, anytime you get into power, it becomes tempting. I don't know if the people behind him who are benefiting from the regime, who don't want him to go.
The hunger zone.
That's the theory which has been put out there, that maybe the man is tired, but the people are urging him to stay.
But where does the buck stop?
Until death, it seems.
Who do you think puts those hungers on in those positions? They don't put themselves there.
Right. Right. So at the moment right now...
But I think it should also be a collective responsibility, especially of the elite.
Right.
Especially when you look at the institution of parliament, for example, really. President Yoweri Museveni himself, frankly, has publicly said he does not care about the quality of the individual who goes to that august house. So long as when his bill comes up, he's able to support it.
And we have seen it in Uganda Parliament time and time again. Recently with the social media bill, which they were taxing social media and the internet and mobile money. Most of the members of Parliament had no idea what they were voting for. They had no idea what actually the significance of taxing social media is. They don't really actually understand the impact of internet in society. We live in the age where you can create a small business tomorrow just going on Facebook and create your website and market your company. But our government sees this as, we call it Lugambo. As
so where is patriotism when we need it? Are these legislators not in fact patriotic to their stomachs? The stomachs of their families and friends?
I think it becomes a career. It has become a career for many. And I don't want to say it's only Uganda, but we also see politicians here in DC making it a career.
Right.
So they just think about their paycheck. How do I survive? How do I stay in parliament for 20 or 30 years?
By the way, I should take this opportunity to apologize to the audience because I sort of misled them by saying that Yoweri Museveni asked his supporters or voters to give him another opportunity to serve his second and last constitutional allowable term in 2021. I actually meant 2001.
Right.
2001.
Right.
That's what I meant. And when we go back to those three things, the fact of the matter that he probably accomplished the professionalizing of the army. And besides, he doesn't necessarily to be the one to do that anyway. And he probably also may have accomplished securing a regional economic market, because the last time I checked, you do have the East African community in place.
Right.
But what about the third and most important, choosing a successor?
Right.
Did he choose himself?
That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma, and that's why I think you have seen people like Amama and Babas get frustrated and leaving. Mugisha Muntu getting frustrated and leaving, Kiza Besigye getting frustrated and leaving. I think that whole generation of leaders also believed that at some point Museveni will give way.
But those were also some of the people who probably helped him, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
Because when you talk about my brother, Amama Mbabazi, he was probably one of those people that was in the front line of championing the idea of Yoweri Museveni who was uniquely gifted and therefore should be given an exception.
Right.
He probably no longer thinks that way.
Right.
Now, Jeff, talk to me about the international perspective, for example. What can the international community do really to help the people of Uganda, to help free the people of Africa?
You know, to be honest, I think this all goes back to the conversation you were just having. I think a large factor in this entire equation is regional leadership, or the lack thereof, on the African continent. If you were talking about some ex-presidents who've come out recently and been a bit forceful on these issues.
I can't wait to air that interview with Bakiri Buluzi.
Yeah, I could count on one hand maybe some ex-presidents who've spoken out forcefully. Former Botswanan President Festus Mogae, you've had former President Chissano in Mozambique, recently Obasanjo in Nigeria, but there's a very few.
Probably still in Botswana, even Ian Kama. Ian Kama.
Exactly, and I think sort of circling back to the way in which you started the show, perhaps we need more Kofi Annans in this world. Although he wasn't a head of state, you know, he never hesitated to speak truth to power. Your first guest was talking about the Iraq War, where he came out very forcefully and said this is an illegal intervention.
Precisely.
He spoke truth to power to the United States and to Britain, which led that illegal, now disastrous intervention.
He did that, and of course he was victimized.
Exactly, and he was victimized for that. So, and I think the other point too, I think is really important to raise is so often leaders like Museveni try to externalize these issues. They try to say the West or the United States is trying to impose their values on us, and they say this is all about Western finger wagging. But if you look at the African Union Charter on Democracy, it's all laid out very clearly right there.
Right.
It got off to a slow start, but I now believe there are 26 countries that have actually signed and ratified the AU Charter on Democracy and Elections. You mentioned you were recently in Southern Africa. They have the static principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. And you mentioned Zimbabwe. Look at their recent election on July 30. And I dare anyone to take a look at those principles and guidelines and point to one that met the criteria that the own region has set out for what determines a free, fair, and credible election. I think the disservice that has been done is, particularly around election time, is that, particularly in the African context, is free, fair, and credible is now somehow equivalent to peaceful. If an election was peaceful and orderly on election day, then it gets the rubber stamp of the African Union, it gets the rubber stamp of regional institutions.
But Jeff, what about some people who say a lot of these democratically challenged African countries, when they organize elections, they are frankly not organizing these elections for the primary stakeholder, who is the citizen. Rather, they are organizing these elections for the development partners.
Well, I think that's certainly there's an argument to be made for that, but I think also, you know, I think we certainly should applaud the fact that multi-party democracy is now the expected norm, that elections now are the norm. But what people, particularly leaders who've been in power for decades at a time, what they've very cleverly done is hold elections that appear credible on a surface level. But if you begin peeling back the layers, again, Zimbabwe is a great example.
These are selections, they're not elections.
Exactly, they were fundamentally flawed from the very outset. And I think.
But what about the fact that the behavior, for example, of some of these leaders on the continent, frankly, a lot of people think they should not really be regarded as leaders because they don't behave as leaders. They should be called what they are, which is rulers.
Right.
That these people are really nyamparas, especially, of Western foreign policy. Nyampara is a Swahili word meaning headman, meaning someone who essentially puts the natives in place and supports whatever the West wants to do, whether it is anti-terrorism policies or whatever it is. And so long as he's able to do that, their Western partners will definitely support them no matter what. When it comes to misbehaving in terms of interacting with their own populations, the Western leaders will look the other way.
Right. You know, I think it's important, I think really quickly to, a lot of this has been sort of focusing on some of the backsliding taking place, but
unfortunately.
Yeah. I was going to say focus on some of the positive as well. We mentioned Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia as one example to sort of...
A new breed of African leaders. Could that be the one?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Not the other ones, you know, at least by the Clinton administration. Well, on that note, our guests today are Dr. Daniel Kauma, Jeffrey Smith, Stephanie Dujarik, and Mildred Tuhaise. Ugandan Ambassador Mar Sebuja Katende will not join us due to scheduling conflict. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning, Esther gives you words, and of course, welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in our social media reporter, Heidi Adams Fitzpatrick. Take it away, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Shaka. We've received excellent and a lot of social media feedback this week. We are, of course, talking to Bobi Wine, who is an outspoken member of the Ugandan parliament. He's also a businessman, an activist, a humanitarian, and a musician. His lyrics often advocate for Uganda's struggling and poor. And so this leads us to our question of the week, which asked, what do you think about Bobi Wine advocating for Uganda? Let's start with a tweet from Irene Nitwe Victor, who tweets he is doing great work, especially in sensitizing the youth about their role to shape their future. He is really inspiring us. We have another tweet from Kamoga Keen, who tweets he should prepare himself for leadership. Uganda loves him. We have another tweet from Sarkozy, who tweets he's a source of inspiration to the youth, especially the ghetto ones, saying if you believe, you can achieve. Our last tweet is from Brian Lumanyika, who tweets, I, as a ghetto kid, he inspires me so much through his music and inspirational talks. He makes me believe one can come from zero to hero. If the parliament can't come to the ghetto should go to parliament. We should be the solution to our problems. Now to our social...